entitled "Mom Demands I Quit Exercising Because It's Unfair." For my golden child brother, who bullied and fat-shamed me with her support, to look unattractive while I'm fit and handsome. She threatened to cancel my gym membership and forced me to eat only oily and sugary foods. So I cut ties with them and went NC. I grew up in my father, Robert's, house with a very clear feeling that I was always slightly out of place. No one ever said it outright, but I understood very early on that this place did not truly belong to me. I was my father's child from before. And Linda, the woman who entered his life after my mother passed away, never saw me as part of her family. I lived under the same roof, ate at the same table, slept in a room at the end of the hallway, but my position was always faint and temporary. Linda never hit me, and she never yelled at me harshly. She chose a different approach, colder and more precise. All of her care and attention went to Eric, her biological son. Whatever Eric liked, he had. Whatever he wanted, he was consulted about, encouraged, and protected. As for me, if I were there, that was fine, and if I was not, no one really noticed. At dinner in the evenings, Linda always served Eric first, asked him about every small detail of his day, while I quietly served myself and ate in silence. From a young age, my body was rounder than Eric's, and that became the perfect excuse for him to tease me whenever he wanted. Comments about my stomach, my walk, and the fact that I ran slower than him were thrown out casually and often. Each time, Linda never stopped him. She smiled, sometimes even added a remark of her own, light in tone but sharp enough to make my throat tighten. She called it joking, said it was for fun, said it was to help me know so I could fix myself. At family gatherings, when relatives came over, Linda would even bring up my appearance on her own. She said I had a good appetite. Said I looked like my father when he was young. Said a man with a little extra weight looked gentle. Everyone laughed. I stood there, embarrassed and confused, not knowing how I was supposed to react, while Eric looked at me with satisfaction, as if he had just won a familiar game. My father, Robert, was often present in those moments. He did not laugh along with Linda, but he did not say anything either. His silence was like a thin wall, not strong enough to protect me, but strong enough to allow Linda to keep doing exactly what she wanted. I waited for him to speak up. Even one sentence in my defense would have been enough. But after waiting for so long, I learned that silence was his safest choice. Linda's words slowly clung to me and became part of my daily life. She would look me up and down and casually say that a boy with a stomach like that looked bad. Sometimes she told me I should eat less, but at the very next meal, she would put more food on my plate and smile, saying children needed to eat well to be healthy. I never understood what she wanted me to be, only that no choice I made was ever right in her eyes. I learned how to stay quiet very quickly. I spoke less at the table, showed up less in shared conversations. I became used to retreating to my room, closing the door, and staying still in that small space. There, I did not have to guess what Linda's looks meant, and I did not have to hear Eric's laughter. I convinced myself that this was fine, that as long as I did not bother anyone, everything would eventually pass. Gradually, I began to see myself as an extra person in my own house. I existed, but I was not taken into account. I lived there, but I did not belong. Every time I saw Eric being praised and protected, I no longer felt jealous. I only felt empty. I kept telling myself that one day I would leave this place, I just did not know when. That feeling stayed with me quietly, settling into my days without resistance. I moved through the house knowing where I stood, or rather, knowing that I did not really stand anywhere. There was no open rejection, only a constant absence of recognition that made everything feel temporary. The day I received my enlistment notice, I thought it was a chance to step out of that house, even if only for a while. It felt like an opening, a narrow one, but enough for me to breathe. I did not frame it as escape, only as leaving, something I had already prepared myself for in my head. I packed my belongings in silence, and no one asked much. There were no long conversations, no reminders, no hesitation. Before I stepped out the door, Linda stood in the kitchen. She did not look at me. She only said one short sentence in a flat voice, more like a reminder than a farewell. That sentence stayed with me the entire way to the barracks. Much later, I finally understood that it was not a wish for good luck. It was the first marker of everything that was about to happen. The military environment gave me a completely different feeling. There, people were seen through discipline and effort. No one asked whose child I was. I was called by my name, given clear tasks, and evaluated by results. For the first time in my life, I felt that I had a place, small but definite. That sense of respect did not come from praise, but from the way others looked straight at me when they spoke. I started training because the job required it, then gradually for myself. I learned to eat on a schedule, cut down on things that weighed my body down, and increase things that made me more resilient. Each change was small, but they followed one another steadily. I did not set big goals. I simply kept a consistent rhythm. Morning training, simple lunch, proper rest at night. Discipline made my mind quieter. The first training sessions were exhausting. I was used to being out of breath, used to the soreness in my muscles. At times, I thought I was not suited for this pace of life, but then I realized everyone was just as tired as I was. Everyone had to push through the same limits. The difference was that no one mocked me. When I tried, others saw it and nodded, and that was enough. My body changed slowly. The weight dropped. My movements became lighter. My breathing steadier. I did not look in the mirror very often, but each time I did, I noticed that I stood a little straighter. Confidence did not come all at once. It returned bit by bit, as if someone were gradually turning on the light in a room that had been closed for a long time. I began to believe that I could do better than I had ever thought. When I went home on leave, I carried a different feeling with me. I no longer avoided people's eyes, and I no longer lowered my head when stepping into the house. My father, Robert, looked at me a little longer. Asked a few short questions. I could hear surprise in his voice, but also caution. Eric looked at me with an expression that was hard to read, half curious, half uncomfortable. Linda was different. The day I walked into the house, she paused for a moment when she saw me. That look was no longer indifferent like before. It carried a clear sense of scrutiny. She asked how I was eating, whether I was tired, then nodded as if she had finished evaluating an object. I felt that change immediately, even though she did not say much. Compliments began to appear, but they were not the kind I had once imagined. Linda said I looked more put together, then reminded me not to train too hard. She said men who were too thin looked weak, and said keeping things moderate was best. Every compliment came with a reminder, as if I were getting close to a boundary she did not want me to cross. Eric also started to comment. He asked what I trained, whether training that much was tiring, then laughed lightly and said the real question was how long I could keep it up. I could hear the irritation in his voice, even though he tried to sound casual. I did not respond much. I did not want my visits home to turn into quiet comparisons. Father Robert Burt watched all of them but kept his habit of silence. He asked if I needed anything, then went back to his newspaper. That silence was so familiar that I no longer expected anything else. I told myself that I was grown now. I did not need anyone to step in and protect me, as long as I knew what I was doing. The meals began to feel different. Linda paid attention to how much I ate, what I took, and what I left behind. She said I should eat more to stay strong, and that training consumed a lot of energy. When I refused, she smiled and told me not to overdo it. I realized that every change I made was being watched closely, as if I were doing something that needed to be controlled. That sense of scrutiny followed me to the table each day. I ate more slowly, more deliberately, aware of her eyes on my plate. Even small choices felt exposed, as though they carried meanings beyond the food itself. That evening, the whole family sat down to eat together. Linda cooked more dishes than usual. The smell of oil and fried food filling the kitchen. The atmosphere felt heavy before anyone said a word. As soon as I sat down, she picked up a large piece of fried food and placed it directly into my bowl. She looked at me and said something in a gentle tone, but every word was deliberate. I looked at the food in my bowl, then up at Linda's face, and I understood that the discomfort she had been hiding for so long had finally begun to surface. When I entered college, I moved out and lived on my own, paying for everything related to my training myself. My gym fees came from part-time work and scholarships, with no involvement from my family. Paying my own way gave me a very clear sense of control. I was responsible for my choices and did not need anyone's permission. I trained consistently, kept a stable routine, and treated it as a normal part of daily life, like eating and sleeping. The change happened quietly, but it did not stay hidden for long. Every time I came home, Eric looked at me more closely than before. He started skipping his usual runs, smoked more, and became irritable over small things. When I asked out of courtesy, Eric gave a thin smile and said he was by, and he was tired. I could see that his form was slipping, and that shift began to change the atmosphere in the house. Family gatherings became the place where everything was shown. Relatives who had not seen me in a long time did not recognize me right away. They asked if I worked out, and said I looked very different. I answered briefly and tried to stay calm. At the same time, Eric was questioned in return, compared in ways that were unintentional but direct. I saw his eyes darken, his hand tighten, and then release. Linda stood nearby with a strained smile, cutting into the conversation, saying, "Every child changes at times," then quickly changing the subject. When people turned away, her gaze lingered on me longer than necessary. I understood it was not concern, but caution. The attention on me made her uncomfortable, even if she had not said it outright. After a few times like that, Linda began to speak more clearly. She told me I should keep things in moderation, not let outsiders think I was trying to draw attention. She said the family needed stability, not changes that made others look. I listened and realized her tone was no longer a reminder. It was a demand. I was expected to be the one who stepped back so everything could return to its familiar place. Eric did not say much, but his attitude was obvious. He made half-joking remarks, asking why I trained so much, then laughed when Linda nodded along. At times, he said I was lucky to have free time, as if my training were a kind of luxury. I did not argue, but the weight started to build inside me. One evening after dinner, Linda called me over. She did not beat around the bush. She said I should know better, that Eric was having a hard time, that my standing out put pressure on him. She said family was a place that needed balance, and the one with more advantages should adjust. I listened to every sentence and realized I was being placed in the position of having to sacrifice for someone else's feelings. I stayed quiet for a moment, then said I had done nothing wrong. I paid for my own gym, I did not show off, I did not ask anyone to change because of me. I said I trained to be healthier, not to compete. That sentence made Linda pause for a brief moment. Eric looked at me, his expression a mix of surprise and discomfort. Linda quickly returned to her familiar tone. She said I was being stubborn, that I did not understand how things worked. She repeated that I lived in a family, and in a family, no one was allowed to get too far ahead. I heard that sentence and realized the boundary had been drawn very clearly. I was allowed to exist, but I was not allowed to stand out. For the first time, I responded directly. I said I could not make myself smaller, just to make others feel comfortable. I said I was used to taking care of myself, and I would continue to do so. The air in the room thickened. Eric turned away. And Linda stared at me, as if she were weighing something. My father, Rober, stayed outside that conversation. He walked past, heard a few words, but did not stop. His silence at that moment was no longer surprising to me. I understood that if something happened, I would have to face it on my own. After that conversation, Linda changed the way she behaved. She no longer spoke indirectly in front of me, but acted perfectly normal in front of others. I could feel a new kind of pressure, more subtle, more tightly controlled. Every time I came home, the atmosphere carried a slight tension, as if everyone were waiting for something. That evening, as I was preparing to return to my rented place, Linda called me into her private room. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were entirely different. I followed her, not knowing that the conversation ahead was about to push everything in a completely different direction. Linda closed the door behind me, and the small room immediately felt tighter. She sat down first and motioned for me to stand across from her. She began slowly, talking about the electricity bill, the water bill, and how household expenses had gone up lately. I listened, already guessing where the conversation was headed, but I let her finish. She shifted to my studies, my part-time job, then stopped at the gym. She said training costs were a luxury, and that the family needed to save money. The way she emphasized the word family made it clear that I was being placed into a calculation whose outcome had already been decided. She said directly that I should cancel my membership. She did not phrase it as a request, but as an order, as if it were self-evident. When I asked why, Linda replied that Eric needed that opportunity more. She said Eric had been tired lately, lacking motivation, and that a good gym would help him get back on track. I told her I paid for my own gym, and that it had nothing to do with the family's finances. I said clearly that I had arranged everything within my own means. Linda looked at me, her eyes turning cold. She said money was money, but fairness was what mattered. I heard the word fairness repeated again and again, each time carrying a different meaning. Linda said I had already made many positive changes and that it was enough. She believed Eric needed to be prioritized now, and that the stronger one should step back. I asked why my progress had become a problem. That question made her lose patience. She said I was being selfish, only thinking about myself. Her voice rose, no longer calm like at the beginning. She said I lived in this house because of whom, benefited from whom, and that I should know my place. I answered that I had never demanded anything from her, that I took care of my own life. Every sentence I spoke made the air heavier, as if I were pressing against a boundary she had guarded for a long time. The conversation turned into a confrontation. Linda stood up and paced the room. She said I was disrupting the balance, that my training and changes were putting pressure on Eric. She believed a peaceful family was one where everyone stayed in their proper position. I asked what my position was. Linda did not answer right away. Eric was standing in the hallway. Knew he was listening. When Linda called his name, her voice softened. She told him that Mom understood, that Mom would handle it. Standing there, I realized I had just been excluded from the idea of family she had been invoking the entire time. I left the room with a heavy feeling. As I passed the kitchen, I heard Linda lower her voice. She told Eric that I should not be allowed to be more than him, that she would not let that happen. Her words were not loud, but they were clear enough to stop me in my tracks. In that moment, I understood that the conversation had not been the end. I was not just facing a demand to cancel my gym membership. I was facing someone determined to keep everything in her chosen order. The fairness Linda spoke of had nothing to do with effort or personal choice. It revolved entirely around protecting Eric. Robert came home late that night. He asked briefly about dinner, about my studies, then fell silent. I did not tell him about the conversation. I knew he would not intervene. His silence felt like a deeply ingrained habit, and I no longer expected a different reaction. By dinner time, Linda walked into the kitchen looking busy. She cooked more dishes than usual, the smell of oil spreading through the house. She placed the plates on the table, glanced at me for a moment, then turned away. Eric sat down first, calm and composed, as if everything had already been settled. His expression suggested that whatever needed to happen had been taken care of. When I sat down at the table, Linda picked up a large piece of fried food and placed it directly into my bowl. She looked at me and said I should eat more to stay strong, as training took a lot of energy. Her voice sounded gentle, but her eyes did not match it. I looked at the food in my bowl, then at Linda, and understood that this was the next step of the so-called fairness she had just imposed. After that night, meals in the house changed quickly. Linda began controlling every small detail, from what was cooked to how I sat down at the table. She asked what I had trained, how long I had trained, then nodded as if she had mapped out my routine. Every conversation ended with a reminder to eat more, because in her view, training burned energy and needed to be compensated. Greasy dishes appeared more often. Linda served me first, piling large portions into my bowl and saying it was for my own good. When I slowed down, she stared and asked whether I disliked the food at home. I answered briefly, and tried to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched made my throat dry every time I swallowed. Eric quickly fell into the rhythm. He made mocking remarks right at the table, asking what I had trained so much for, then laughed when I did not respond. Sometimes, lasting a few months was already impressive, speaking as if my training were just a temporary phase. Linda smiled when she heard that, gave a small nod, and treated it as a reasonable comment. My father, the Robert, sat across from me, holding his bowl of rice, his eyes lingering for a few seconds before turning away. He did not join in, and did not intervene. His silence made Eric's words pass more easily, as if they were a normal part of a family meal. I looked at my father, waiting for even a small reaction, but what I received was the familiar avoidance. I started buying my own food. I stored it in a small cabinet in the kitchen, and clearly wrote my name on it. I thought that would ease the tension. If everyone ate their own food, then things would be lighter. The next morning, when I opened the cabinet, the containers were gone. Linda stood by the sink and said food left too long was not good. She had cleared it out to keep things tidy. I asked her where she had put it. Linda replied that she had thrown it away because she thought I did not need those things. Her voice was calm, as if it were a reasonable decision. I could clearly feel my boundaries being erased bit by bit. Taking care of myself, in her eyes, had become something that needed to be corrected. From that day on, I ate in a state of alert. Every time I put my bowl down, I felt as if I were sitting in an unsafe place. Linda watched every movement. Eric continued his teasing, and my father, Robert, remained silent. Meals were no longer a time to rest. They turned into a prolonged test. One evening, Linda looked straight at me and said I should reconsider training. She said this house had no obligation to accommodate personal habits that disrupted the common order. I asked her what order meant. Linda replied that order was when everyone knew their place and did not make others uncomfortable. That sentence made me realize that any attempt to explain was useless. I said I was not bothering anyone, that I paid for everything myself, and managed my own time. Linda listened, then gave a thin smile and said that living in this house meant following this house's rules. She said plainly that I did not have the right to decide everything on my own. Eric looked up at me with a satisfied expression. My father, Robert, set his bowl down, seemed about to say something, then stopped. That hesitation told me that if anyone were going to step in, it would not be him. I felt myself being pushed into a corner, a place where every possible choice was treated as wrong. That night, I went back to my room earlier than usual. I rearranged my things and prepared for the next day, moving quietly and methodically, trying to keep my thoughts steady. When I opened the drawer, I noticed something was missing. I checked again, then a third time. My gym card and the documents related to the membership were no longer there. I stood still for a moment, and listened to the sounds coming from the kitchen downstairs. Plates clinked softly. Linda's voice carried on in a low but clear tone as she spoke to Eric. I clenched my hand, stared at the empty drawer, and understood that dinner had only been the beginning. What was happening had already crossed beyond words, and the next step had just begun. The next morning, I directly asked Linda about the missing gym card and documents. She looked at me with just enough surprise, said she had no idea what I was talking about. Her tone was calm, as if I had asked something unreasonable. When I repeated the details, she shook her head and told me I should check my room more carefully. The way Linda denied it made me feel like I was making things up. She said I tended to be overly suspicious. Said that lately I was obsessed with training, and was prone to overthinking. Eric sat beside her, saying nothing, but his eyes followed every word Linda spoke, as if waiting for a conclusion that had already been decided. Not long after, I realized the story had moved beyond the house. A relative called me, asked about my health, then indirectly mentioned that I was training too much. The voice carried a kind of forced concern, saying that Linda was having a hard time because of me. I understood that the story had been retold in a different way, and that I was becoming the problematic character in it. Similar calls started coming more often. Each person asked whether I was okay, whether I needed rest. They mentioned my appearance, how quickly I had changed. I listened and noticed the details were strangely consistent, as if someone had prepared a script in advance. I began to feel surrounded by concern that made it hard to breathe. At home, the atmosphere grew stifling. Linda behaved perfectly normally in front of others, even acting worried about me. She asked if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping well, and then sighed softly. Each question felt like another marker in the process of turning me into someone who needed fixing. I tried to talk to my father, Robert. I told him about the food being thrown away, the missing gym card, and the things Linda had said to relatives. He listened, nodded slowly. He said that the approach was not right, that things needed to be talked through clearly. For the first time in many years, I felt him stand on my side, even if cautiously. But when my father spoke to Linda, everything slipped again. Linda cut him off and said I was imagining things. She said I was overly sensitive, that I had a tendency to exaggerate. She turned to me and said I was disturbing the family with negative thinking. My father seemed about to say more, then fell silent, as if used to being pushed aside. I stood there, listening to Linda's words, and realized that all the evidence I had become fragile. Every action of mine was interpreted as a sign of instability. Every reaction was treated as unreasonable resistance. I began to understand that this confrontation was not about finding the truth, but about deciding who would be pushed out. That evening, Linda called me over and spoke plainly. She said I was not her child, that she had no responsibility to accommodate all of my choices. Her voice was not loud or sharp, but it was very clear. She emphasized that I was living under a roof whose order she maintained, and that I should remember that. That sentence sent a chill through me. I looked to my father, Robert, waiting for a reaction, but he turned away. Eric leaned against the doorway, his expression hard to read. In that moment, I felt completely alone. I was no longer someone in an argument. I had become an object that needed to be controlled. I retreated to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed, trying to sort through what had just happened. From the gym card disappearing, to the calls from relatives, to the way Linda denied everything, it all came together into a clear picture. I was being separated from the shared story. Step by step, my phone vibrated in my hand while I was still thinking. A message appeared from an unfamiliar number, notifying me of a request to cancel my gym membership. I read the line several times, my heart beating faster. I knew I had not sent any such request, and in that moment, I understood that things had gone far beyond anything I had imagined. The next morning, I laid all the evidence related to the gym on the table. The message confirming the membership cancellation request, the payment history, and the email response from the gym, everything all clear. I said I had never submitted any request, and that someone had used my personal information to interfere. Linda glanced over it, her expression calm, then pushed the stack of papers aside as if they were meaningless advertisements. She said I was making a big deal out of nothing, that what I brought proved nothing, that misunderstandings happened, and that I should focus on my studies instead of clinging to the gym. I asked her directly whether she had done it. Linda did not answer head. She said I was being offensive, then turned to Father Robert, with a weary look, as if I were a long-standing burden. Eric leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene with visible discomfort. When I turned and asked if he knew anything about it, Eric shrugged and said he just wanted things to go back to how they were. He said I had changed too much, that everyone had lived more peacefully before. His voice was not raised, but it was enough for me to understand that my presence had become the problem. I looked at Eric, and realized those words did not come from concern. They came from a desire for the old kind of calm, where I made myself smaller, where he did not have to compare himself, where Linda did not have to feel uncomfortable. I asked Eric if he had ever thought about how I felt. Eric stayed silent, then turned away, as if the question did not deserve an answer. I turned to Linda and said everything. I spoke about the years of being overlooked, the meals filled with implication, my food being thrown away, the gym card disappearing, and the story being retold to relatives. I talked about the feeling of being watched, doubted, and turned into the one with problems in my own family. With each sentence, the room grew quieter. My father, Robert, stood up and rested his hand on the back of the chair, as if he were about to say something, but Linda cut him off. She said I was blaming others, that I always saw myself as the victim, that she had endured enough. Her voice turned cold, no longer carrying the fake gentleness from before. Linda said plainly that I was not part of this household. She said I was Robert's child, not hers, and that she had no obligation to tolerate choices that disrupted the family. She said the house needed order, and if I could not accept that, I could leave. The sentence landed clearly, without needing any further explanation. I looked at my father, Robert. He avoided my eyes, his hand clenched and then loosened. His silence this time felt different from before. It felt like confirmation that he would not step in anymore. I understood that if I stayed, things would continue this way, or worse. I went back to my room and packed my belongings in silence. Each item I put into my bag was tied to a period when I had tried to fit in. I did not cry, and I did not argue anymore. I knew I had said enough, and everything that needed to be heard had already been spoken. When I pulled my bag toward the door, Linda was standing in the kitchen. She did not look at me, she only said that I should think carefully before doing things that made other people uncomfortable. Eric sat at the table, his head lowered as he looked at his phone. My father, Robert, stood at the end of the hallway and did not come any closer. I opened the door and stepped outside. The night air was colder than I expected, but it was easier to breathe than the house behind me. I walked a short distance, then stopped. I turned back and looked at the house one last time. The kitchen light was still on. And everything looked ordinary. As if nothing had ever happened. When I walked farther away, my phone vibrated. A relative texted to ask if I was okay. They said Linda had just told them a story about me, that I was rebellious, that I was obsessed, that I was causing trouble for myself. I read the message and kept walking into the darkness, and I understood that even though I had left that house, the story about me had not ended. I moved out to live alone, and the first days were very quiet. The small room had just enough space for a bed, a desk, and a few boxes I had not unpacked yet. Freedom arrived at the same time as pain, like two sides of the same coin. I no longer had to watch Linda's expressions, no longer had to hear Eric's half-joking remarks. But the silence also forced me to face a lingering sense of emptiness. In the early mornings, I woke up earlier than usual. I made coffee, sat, and watched the light spill through the window, trying to get used to a new rhythm. Sometimes I felt light, sometimes heavy. I missed my father, Robert. Missed the moments when he asked about me in his restrained way. And I also missed the things that were never said. That sense of missing did not pull me back. It only reminded me that I had left a place once called home. After a few weeks, the family began to reach out. Messages came sporadically, sometimes from Robert, sometimes from familiar relatives. Apologies appeared slow and awkward. Some said things had gone too far, some said Linda was hot-tempered, some said Eric had not meant it. I read them all and replied briefly. I said I was okay, that I was not blaming anyone, that I needed time. I did not revisit what had happened, and I did not ask for explanations. Linda also sent a message. She said she had thought that things could be talked through again more clearly. I read it and did not reply right away. I knew that if I opened that conversation, everything would return to the old loop, where my story would be told in a different way. I chose silence, not as punishment, but to keep the distance I needed for myself. Eric sent a short message, saying he hoped I would be less rigid. I stared at that line for a long time. He did not ask how I was living, did not ask what I needed. He only hoped I would return to my old state so everyone else could feel comfortable. I did not respond. This time, my silence was a deliberate decision, not the familiar retreat from before. I continued going to school, working, and returned to the gym on my own schedule. Training was no longer a statement, it became an ordinary habit. I trained consistently, ate simply, and slept enough. Every time I lifted weights or ran, I could clearly feel my body moving according to my own will, without needing anyone's permission. That brought a sense of safety I had never known. On some tired days, I sat alone and thought about my family. I thought about Linda and the way she called it fairness. I thought about Eric, and his desire for calm. I thought about Robert and the silence that had followed him for years. Those thoughts came and went, no longer dragging me down the way they once did. I realized I could understand them without having to go back and endure more. One evening, I received a call from Robert. He asked if I could come back for dinner, and said everyone missed me. I listened and felt the sincerity in his voice, but I also recognized the familiar hesitation. I told him I was grateful for the invitation, but for now, I chose to stay where I was living. I said I needed to keep this rhythm so I would not lose what I had just rebuilt. Robert was silent for a few seconds, then said he understood. The call ended gently. I set my phone down and noticed my hands were no longer shaking like before. Staying on my own was no longer a reflex. It had become a clear choice. I was not closing the door completely on my family. I was only closing the door that led back to that house. As time passed, I learned how to take care of myself in very simple ways. I cooked, cleaned, and planned my week ahead. I made a few friends at the gym and talked about ordinary things. Each evening, I wrote down a few lines about what I had managed to do that day. Those small routines kept me grounded in the present. Sometimes, I asked myself whether I would ever go back and talk to Linda again. The question surfaced, then settled. I knew that keeping distance was necessary for now. Went NC was not about cutting off all feelings. It was a boundary that kept me from being pulled back into old loops. I held that boundary with steadiness, not with anger. I continued living my life slowly and firmly. I chose what made me healthier, both physically and mentally. I allowed myself to move forward without needing approval from the place that once made me shrink. When I looked back at the path I had taken, I understood very clearly what I had done. I did not leave because I hated them. I left because, for the first time, I chose to respect myself. If you are in a similar situation, remember that choosing yourself does not make you selfish. Taking care of your health, both physical and mental, has never been wrong. And sometimes, creating a bit of distance is the only way to avoid losing yourself. Thank you for listening to this story. If you saw yourself somewhere in these lines, share it so others know they are not alone, and follow the channel to keep walking alongside everyday stories, where every choice deserves to be understood.